Okay, good morning. I think we can get started. We waited a couple of minutes just for more people to connect online, and this is a hybrid event, so we have people in person and also a number of people, both from representations of in Rome and also colleagues connecting online. So good morning and welcome to this seminar. It's a big pleasure for me to welcome Professor Ralph Ossa, who's the Chief Economist at the World Trade Organization, WTO. My name is Boubacar Ben Belhassan, and I'm the Director of the Markets and Trade Division, and I'll be moderating the event today. Ralph is a professor at the Department of Economics of the University of Zurich, and he's currently on leave to serve as Chief Economist at the WTO. At the university, he holds the Cohn Foundation Professorship of International Trade and is director of the Cohn Center for Sustainable Trade and Logistics. He has also taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Princeton. His research focuses on international economics and trade. He has written very interesting papers, and I hope you have read some of them, about beginnings of trade negotiation, and also trade wars. He has also worked on deeper integration of trade agreement, a topic on which we also work in the division, in the Markets and Trade Division, with emphasis on the environment-related provision of regional trade agreements, or RTAs. Ralph, welcome to FAO. We are very happy to have you join us today. As we discussed before also when we met in Geneva, that at the Markets and Trade Division, we have a very close relationship with WTO, so we exchange a lot of knowledge, and we attend meetings, we write documents jointly, and so we have a very good collaboration, and we hope we even strengthen that. And we are working on many topics related to agriculture trade, of course, always from a food security and nutrition perspective, including on the linkages of trade with sustainable development. For example, in the 2018 edition of one of FAO's flagship reports, the State of Agricultural Commodity Markets, what we call it SOCO, in short, focused on trade and climate change, which is related to the topic of your talk today. For today's seminar, Ralph will discuss his work on how trade can help climate change mitigation measures to reach out globally, which is, I think it's a big effort in everybody. We are working toward the adaptation and mitigation to climate change. I think this is a very important topic when we look at it from a trade perspective. He will present the findings of ongoing research on the economic effects of optimal climate change, action induced by a worldwide tax on greenhouse gas emission, or what we also know as carbon tax. His analysis is conducted using a quantitative trade model, which allows to put numbers on the idea or the concept of sustainable globalization. Ralph, again, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. I'll give you the floor, and then I think Ralph will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, presenting the work that they're doing, and then after that we'll have an opportunity to discuss and a session for comments and questions. So, Ralph, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Boubacar and colleagues from the FAO, for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts here on trade and sustainability. So this is work I started when I was still in academia, so it really started as an academic project, but I do think it has some policy relevance, so in a way it's also marking my own transition from one world into the other. And this hybrid nature, let's say, of this work is also reflected in the presentation a little bit. So it starts off, so I basically start off just giving you the big picture, and the kind of main messages, the main insights, and then I move to the more kind of technical bit for the ones who are interested also in some of the more technical details. So I've structured it like this. So if we could have the first slide, that would be great. You can already do the second slide. Yeah, exactly. So, the main point I'm going to make is quite straightforward, but in my view, quite important and also underappreciated. And the point is, that international trade really has a bad reputation when it comes to the environment. You go to any supermarket in Switzerland, I don't know how it is in Italy, but it's taken as self-evident pretty much that buying local goods is always better for the environment. And if you want to make the green choice, then you have to, buy the local product. And, this is also very understandable because, when people think about trade, they think about transportation. And when they think about transportation, they think about transport emissions. You think of dirty trucks and dirty planes and dirty ships and so on. So it's kind of intuitive, I think, to think that, the local production, local consumption or consumption of local goods is always the green choice. But if you think about it, a little bit, I think very quickly realize that, transport emissions are important. So I'm not, trying to deny that. And I think it's also important to reduce transport emissions. But they're only part of the overall emissions associated with production and consumption. In particular, they're also production emissions. So if you look at the data, transport emissions are a relatively small share of overall emissions. So production emissions are a much larger share. And then importantly, there's a lot of variation in production emissions across countries. So to the extent that you buy something from a relatively green origin, even though you incur transport emissions, on balance, it can still be kind of net beneficial for the environment because the additional, the production emissions that you save, if you will, more than offset the additional transport emissions that you incur. Which means that buying green is not necessarily the same as buying local. And as I'll argue, it's going to be really important to embrace international trade in the fight against climate change. So here's an example from the food sector, and this is based on work from a PhD student of mine who graduated from the University of Zurich. And what she had is she had a collaboration with a European retailer whose identity, we are not allowed to disclose. So it's a European retailer. Basically, imagine like a supermarket, where you go and shop. And what they had is they had, they gave a very detailed data also on the prices and quantities of the goods they sold. And she did some analysis on that. But what I want to share with you here is they did some pretty detailed analysis of the transport emissions associated with the goods they were selling, and also the production emissions. And what you see on the left-hand side, it's not the best color choice, I admit, but the point is, so basically the dark blue bars, that's kind of, or the dark blue area, that's the share of transport emissions in total emissions. And the light blue or gray area is the share of production emissions. And it's differentiated by mode of transportation. So we have a truck at the top, we have a plane at the bottom, and in the middle we have like a mixed mode. So basically kind of the typical product, has some combination of them all. And what you see is that for those food products, so you see that, transport emissions are really a very small part of overall emissions, which kind of makes the point I was making before. Now, if you look a little bit more broadly, I think the OECD estimates that about a third of the emissions that are related to tradable goods are due to transport emissions. So what this retailer here shows is a little bit, even smaller than I think what would be true for the average. But still, that's the one part. What you see on the right-hand graph is you see a bunch of food products, and on the horizontal axis, you see the emissions intensity, basically, of these products, and the distribution it's basically the distribution of emissions intensities across a number of countries, and you can see a bunch of things. I mean, the one thing that you can see, and you all know that like beef, for example, beef production is of course associated with higher emissions than vegetable production, so that's not new. But the main point for my purposes here is that these distributions are relatively wide. In other words, saying that there's a lot of variation in production emissions across countries, and there's all sorts of reasons for this. For food products, you probably know this much better than I do, but for products more broadly, for example, the energy mix is very, very important, and we know that there's huge variation in, how green the energy mix is across countries. So, I already alluded to this, but what this means is that, international trade doesn't have to be, but can be part of the solution if we engage in what I call green sourcing, which is, buying goods from relatively green origins. And, for a long time I was kind of, I guess suggesting that this is what one should do. But then if you start thinking about it, it clearly is not going to kind of work in the aggregate. If you look at the energy mix, for example, Switzerland is very green, also very strict environmental regulations. So somehow this green sourcing logic, if I kind of, if you think about it like that, would suggest that we should all buy all our goods from Switzerland, and that obviously, is not going to work. A, because there's not enough production capacity there, and B, because people elsewhere also need to work, so in economics, from an economics perspective, it's kind of a partial equilibrium concept. So, what we do on this paper here is we kind of extend this notion of this partial equilibrium notion to a general equilibrium concept, and this general equilibrium concept are the environmental gains from trade, and really a specialization according to environmental comparative advantage. And these are really the kind of main, the main terms I think or the main concepts I want to socialize today, the idea of environmental gains from trade and environmental comparative advantage. And what's the idea? So the idea, if you know kind of trade theory a little bit, the concept of comparative advantage. And the concept of comparative advantage is basically saying that countries specialize in the sectors in which they are relatively good at. So not absolutely good at, if you have productivity differences, for example, across countries, it could be that Switzerland is more productive in pretty much any sector than, I don't know, some other country. But there's also comparative advantage, which is, you just compare the productivity differences across sectors. And then what you get when you trade typically is you get countries specializing in the sectors in which they're relatively productive. And so these are the this is economic comparative advantage, and the idea with the environmental comparative advantage is similar. So rather than buying everything from a green country, kind of the point is that you want to encourage countries to specialize in the industries and the products that they are relatively green at producing, because like that, every country can make a contribution when it comes to fighting climate change. So if you think about the implications of this, if countries specialize according to their economic comparative advantage, you get the economic gains from trade, and we all know this. Basically, the gains from specialization, right? And it's the same with the environmental gains from trade. So if countries specialize according to their environmental comparative advantage, you get environmental gains from trade. So you get a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the key difference between the two concepts, though, from an economics perspective, is that the economic gains from trade kind of materialize naturally. So if you let market forces play out, then at least on average, typically there are economic gains from trade. There are all sorts of distributional implications we can discuss, but that's not the point I want to make today. But the environmental gains from trade, they need some help, if you will. Because, and the reason they need some help is because there's a market failure. And the market failure is that when we produce and when we consume, we don't take the consequences that our choices have on the environment into account. So if you want to kind of unlock the environmental gains from trade, you need to do something to correct this market failure. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to say that trade is always good for the environment. That's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that if you put the right policies in place, trade can be a very important force for good when it comes to climate change. So that's what we kind of do in this paper here, is we try to quantify the potential environmental gains from trade. So how important could these environmental gains from trade be potentially? And in order to quantify this, what we do is we take a quantitative trade model. So it's kind of a standard quantitative model of the world economy, with, many countries, many sectors, input-output linkages, so you have global value chains and so on. And, we dream the economist's dream, so to speak, and we just hit the model with the worldwide carbon tax. And, this is not to say that this is something that, we expect to happen. This is really just to try to quantify kind of how large these environmental gains in trade could be if the market failure associated with these environmental externalities was corrected. And that's the idea. So we hit the model with the worldwide carbon tax, and we pick $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So it's not a carbon tax, literally, it's a tax on greenhouse gas emissions more broadly. And we kind of see what is going to happen, and what is going to happen if you hit the model with the carbon tax. Greenhouse gas emissions are going to go down, so not so surprising. But then the interesting thing is we decompose this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions into a bunch of components, and I'll show that to you in detail, but in particular also the environmental gains from trade. Yeah, and the punchline finding that I want to leave with you is that more than 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions that are achieved by the carbon tax are due to the environmental gains from trade. Yeah, so the fact that countries specialize in the products in which they're relatively green at has huge potential to contribute to decarbonization. And the reason I think this is so important is because, well, I said at the beginning, trade really has a bad reputation when it comes to the environment, but so people perceive it as part of the problem. But I think really if you put the right kind of policies in place, it can be an important part of the solution. And the reason I think this is important is that, my view is that we'll only be able to successfully fight climate change if we do it in a way that's kind of economically efficient, that kind of reduces the economic costs of this intervention, because otherwise it's just not going to be feasible politically. You see this in every country. As soon as the prices of fuel go up, people go to the streets, and I can understand that. So I think if we want to be serious about achieving our climate objectives, we need to make sure that we pursue them in a way that's causes the least economic costs. And my view is that embracing trade is an important part of this. So this is the kind of the big picture part. So now I'm going to go a little bit more into the technical details, and we can skip this slide. It's just you can go to the next slide. This is just to tell you what other work has been done in this area, and I think we're pretty confident that we are socialized, or we kind of introduced this idea of environmental gains from trade. But I'm not trying to. You're not like referees of a journal, so I don't need to convince you that this is like so innovative. It's a different audience. So then let me go a little bit into the details, and I don't want to spend too much time, because I think maybe some of you are interested, but most of you probably not so much in all the details. But just let me give you a flavor of how this works. So we have many countries, and we have many industries, and we have input-output linkages in the model. So we have global value chains. And it's a so-called Armington model, which is basically a standard kind of quantitative trade model. So there's really nothing so different than we do here in terms of the model than we do in other studies. And we have a worldwide carbon tax, as I said, and the way we think about this is that so the way we model this, so just you get a sense of it. So the carbon tax is imposed on all goods and services, and here, just to make our life easy, we do it. We levy it in the country of final or intermediate consumption, but that doesn't really make a difference. But the key thing to keep in mind is that the effective carbon tax is going to be higher on a good that is very emissions intensive. Simply because you the tax applies to the carbon content or the greenhouse gas emissions of a particular good. So if you buy a relatively brown good, it's just going to get relatively more expensive. The effective tax that you put on it is going to be higher. So without going into details here, on the equations, but basically what the tax is going to do, so on the consumption side, what the carbon tax is going to do is it's going to make browner goods relatively more expensive. So the reason it's going, or the way it's going to operate on kind of on households is, it's going to change the prices they face, and it's going to make the brown goods relatively more expensive. And similarly for farms, the farms also buy intermediate goods, and again, it's going to make the relatively dirty intermediate goods more expensive. So in terms of transportation, so this is of course kind of important how we model transportation, because we kind of made the point at the beginning that there's transportation emissions and there's production emissions. So we want to be clear how we model transportation. And maybe let me just say also, we can talk about this in detail if you want, but let me maybe just say that I think we model it in a reasonable way. So maybe just go to the next slide. So here's the decomposition, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that, even without looking at the equation necessarily. But so the model we look at is a static model, and there's not going to be any change in terms of technology. So it's not that the tax is going to lead to innovation or anything like that. Yeah, we kind of disregard that. So really what the tax, so the way the tax is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we basically can decompose that into three channels. The first channel is, you have a tax, and in particular a tax on brown goods. So overall economic activity is just going to shrink a little bit. So environmental economists would call this a scale effect. Yeah, so you can think of like the world economy just shrinking a little bit. And that's, of course, going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Then you can say, conditional on kind of an aggregate size of the economy, you're going to get some reallocation across sectors. So, browner sectors, goods from browner sectors are going to become relatively more expensive. So households and farms are going to shift expenditure away from the brown goods towards the green goods. Yeah, and this is a composition effect, and in particular a composition effect across sectors. And notice that both the scale effect, the first one, and the sectoral composition effect has nothing to do with international trade. Yeah, this is something you would also get in a closed economy. Even if you didn't have any international trade, you would still get an effect on the aggregate size of the economy, and you would get some reallocation across sectors. Just for 1 second. But the third effect that's new here, and that's really unique to international trade, is conditional on expenditure in a given sector. You can now reallocate production across countries and expenditure across countries, and in particular, relatively brown. If I'm relatively brown at producing a particular good, my good is going to become relatively more expensive. So households and farms are going to shift expenditure towards relatively green sources. Yeah, and this is exactly this green sourcing effect that I was talking about, and that's so it's kind of a composition effect, but across countries. And that's what we call the environmental gains from trade, and that's what we're trying to quantify here. Yeah, so the name of the game is just to put a number on that top. You can skip this. This is just the next slide. This is just some technical stuff. So basically to say that we kind of calibrate this model like people in academia would do it. So just in terms of the data, so we have basically 64 countries, including the rest of the world. So this kind of basically all countries in the world. We have 45 sectors, including a sector that we call not elsewhere specified. So basically we also include all sectors that there are. So basically encompassing the whole world economy in 2018. We get our trade data from the OECD, and then there was quite some data effort getting the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to production and trade. And we not only look at CO2 emissions, but we also look at nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions, using among other things also data from the FAO. And then we hit the model with the carbon tax and see what happens. And let me walk you through this here. So the first thing that comes out, and this is the top left panel, and this is not really the main point we're trying to make here, but I think it's still kind of interesting. What comes out is that a worldwide carbon tax is actually remarkably efficient. So what you see in this, so this is the graph with the green curve. So on the y-axis, you see the emissions reduction that is achieved, and on the x-axis, you see the carbon tax. And where the little dotted line is, that would be $100. So we just pick that as our kind of reference value. And of course, the higher the carbon tax, the more the emissions reduction. But you see that a $100 carbon tax in this model would reduce emissions by around 25%. And if you then look in the panel just below that with the red line, it shows you the real income loss associated with this. So basically the welfare loss, and I shouldn't say welfare loss, because welfare goes up, of course, because we save the climate, but the economic cost of it, the real income loss. And you see it's actually quite small. So it's only 0.7%. We also look at the GDP loss or gross output loss, to be more precise. That would be 2.6%. It's at the top right. So it's kind of remarkable that you get a lot of emissions reduction for relatively small economic costs. But that's not really the main point. I think we know that a carbon tax is relatively effective. What's more interesting is for our purposes here, is the bottom right panel, which basically gives you the trade to GDP ratio, if you will. And you see that no matter what carbon tax you impose, the trade to GDP ratio is pretty flat, which already gives you a sense that even if carbon is going to become very expensive, you're not going to stop international trade. And this is really the kind of the key result now, the result of the decomposition. So what we have on the x-axis is the carbon tax, and what we have on the y-axis is the result of this decomposition. So remember, greenhouse gas emissions are going to fall, and they can fall because of a scale effect. They can fall because of a composition effect across sectors, so people just buying greener stuff. And they can fall because of a composition effect across countries. And the composition effect across countries, that's exactly the environmental comparative advantage. And what you see, and that's really the key result of the paper, pretty much no matter what carbon tax you hit the model with, these environmental gains from trade are kind of stable at around, at more than 1/3, which is kind of driving home the message, I hope, that it's important to embrace trade in the fight against climate change. And let me just show you two more slides, and then we can stop. Then we kind of look a little bit more in detail. What the economic, how these composition effects pan out, exactly. And here in this first graph, you see the cross-sectoral reallocation. And on the y-axis, you see the emissions intensity of a sector, basically. So how brown a sector is on average across all countries, if you will. And on the y-axis, you see the change in, you can think of it as the change in output, world nominal output in that sector. And, this straight line is zero. So basically all the dots that are above zero, those are sectors that are going to grow. And the other dots are sectors that are going to fall. And you see exactly what you expect to see. You see that, expenditure or output in the relatively brown sectors falls, and output in the relatively green sectors goes up. So not so surprising. But, you do see some kind of pretty strong effects, and there we need to start thinking a little bit about, plausibility. So, for example, you see that energy, so we have a reduction here by 25% in kind of energy output. And, we were wondering, is this kind of reasonable or not? Could we, is this a change that's kind of plausible? But then we realized that, we came to the conclusion that probably yes, because what you have to keep in mind is it's not just, it's not saying that, we all individually directly use 25% less energy, but it's saying that, all our consumption and production choices collectively. So it's not just that we, save energy in our daily lives directly, but we also buy goods that are relatively less energy intensive, which are produced by farms that have adjusted their production mix to be more energy intensive and so on. So it's kind of the cumulative effect on that. Then maybe the next, let's skip that, maybe the next one. So let me, so that's kind of the last technical slide I'll show you, and then I'll conclude. So then we also try to illustrate this this cross-country reallocation, and this is not, I mean, this is not the best graph, I think, to show this. So we're still working on this. But to some extent, what you see, and this is not the main point I want to make, but you see that you get some reallocation of cost of production from relatively green to, from relatively brown to relatively green countries. So let's just go to the very end of the presentation. So just click through, just keep going, just keep going, keep going, more. Yeah, so let's just go there. So there's a bunch of other, stuff in the paper that we can talk about. But in the interest of time, let me just conclude, so we also have some time to discuss. So what we do, I think, is to provide a first estimate of the environmental gains from trade driven by environmental comparative advantage, and the main result is that the environmental gains from trade are large, accounting for more than 1/3 of the emissions reduction brought about by a carbon tax, which means that, contrary to conventional wisdom, I think it's crucial to embrace international trade in the fight against climate change. And let me just, again, I said it, but be clear about two things. So first, I'm not trying to say that trade is always good for the environment. I'm just saying it's important to embrace trade, when we think about the policies that we put in place. And second, I'm also, neither advocating for necessarily nor predicting that we're going to have a worldwide carbon tax. I've only been in the policy world now for half a year, but I also know that that's unlikely to happen. So this is really just we just look at this counterfactual to get a sense of how large these environmental gains from trade could potentially be. Thanks.
Thank you, Ralph. Let me also activate my camera on Zoom. Okay, thank you, Ralph, for the very interesting presentation. I think it's very rich, of course. It's difficult to present all the findings and to explain and go into detail into this, very rich technical work that you have done. So thanks for sharing those. What we will do, we will open the floor for questions, for comments that you may have. So we have colleagues and here in the room, and then also virtually. Please raise your hand virtually, and then we will give you the floor in that order. Given that I have the floor, Ralph, my question now, of course, I mean, you focused a lot on the environmental gains of this, and I think one of the argument or the point for when we talk about the carbon tax is in terms of the cost, right? In terms of the economic side, and then how goods, become more expensive. And I'm only thinking from a food security perspective. So that what will this mean? Okay, we reach in terms of trade-offs, right? So we have all the environmental gains. What do we get in terms of the economics if the situation is becoming more expensive, and we know that people are actually struggling to even pay sometimes for their food, and they spend a good share of their income, especially the poorer households on food. So a little bit on probably this trade-offs, and then after that, I think we can discuss more.
No, I think it's
would like to elaborate, and then we'll go the time that we have colleagues digesting and taking the floor for more questions. Thanks.
No, so thanks for this question, which is of course spot on, and these are some of the slides I skipped now, but clearly. Well, let me maybe make 2 points. So the first one, just in the context of the model, it's absolutely clear that the tax, of course, makes goods more expensive, and in particular brown goods more expensive. And I recognize that this it's just an empirical fact that especially poor countries tend to be kind of relatively relatively brown, and that they tend to produce in relatively brown industries and also use relatively brown technologies, which means that, you know, a carbon tax, if you just blindly impose it the way we do it here in this model, is going to hit developing countries particularly hard. So it's not just that the costs of climate change are borne disproportionately by poor countries, but the cost of such climate action would also be borne disproportionately by poor countries, which is, of course, why, you know, presumably you would need to think about some sort of distribution scheme, which we have also done some simulations here. But that's a really important point. Another point, which is a little bit outside of the model, is that, so in the model, it's true that if you impose a carbon tax, this will have some economic costs. You know? But so if you just want to maximize GDP, you don't impose a carbon tax. But some colleagues from the World Bank have done some interesting work, which is again outside the scope of this model, but where they basically argue that you know, that this could also be an opportunity to just reform tax systems and make them kind of more efficient, and that might actually, you know, minimize the economic costs, but still.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. Let's sorry, I also activated my microphone for on Zoom. Okay, so we'll go. I see that we have a virtual Mr. Schmitz asking for the floor. So please, if you would also introduce yourself and then ask the question, and then we'll try to get more questions as we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear and see me, because I don't see myself, but I suppose
we see you.
Very good. So my name is Jan Schmitz. I'm the Deputy Chief Economist of the Trade Department of the European Commission in Brussels. So we are obviously also looking into the linkage of trade and environmental impact, as this is very high on the agenda of the policymakers in the EU. So, and we of course fully support the use of carbon taxation as means to effectively and efficiently reduce carbon emissions by internalizing the external social cost of those emissions. So that's exactly the point you make. And although we agree it's probably a little bit part of a dream world what you present, I think it's very interesting both from a research perspective as well as from the policy perspective, because you show that a global uniform carbon price can be very effective and very efficient in reducing the carbon emissions globally, right? And it's effective, obviously, because it's uniform, so there's no carbon leakage. You have, you know, the costs internalized where they happen, and it's efficient because you very eloquently explained that the environmental comparative advantage is actually leading to the emissions being reduced where the costs of reducing these emissions are the lowest, right? And this could, by the way, also lead to the potential of where the developed countries could help developing countries where probably these marginal costs are relatively low, could work together in order to achieve, you know, the global reduction of emissions. So we're very happy to engage with you on this stream of research, which is a little bit different to other research we have seen at the WTO. So we are very happy to, you know, engage with you on that basis, because we think trade really has a role in reducing global emissions.
Thank you very much. We'll take more questions. I see Astrid, that she has a question here. So Astrid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Astrid Agostini. I'm from the Investment Center here in FAO. Thanks a lot for a very, very interesting talk. I was wondering, first of all, you skipped through one slide that I think might be quite interesting for us, which is the intersectoral, the kind of impacts on different sectors of this. That would be fantastic if you could maybe show that and take us through those results as well. And then I was wondering, how do you look at land use change in this? I mean, given that we know 10% of emissions is deforestation, 90% of deforestation is agriculture, to be kind of very rough. That's significant. I was wondering how that comes up in your model. And I was also wondering, I mean, generally we know from the reality, as you said, this is a model, this is looking at the potential gains here. But we know if even in the EU ETS, which is the most sophisticated, maybe one of the most sophisticated carbon pricing mechanisms, agriculture and forestry land use isn't in there yet, even with the new introduction now of additional sectors. And I think there's only one country in New Zealand, I think, which has forestry in the pricing mechanism. So what we see effectively, though, is that in some countries there's incentives through offsets. Actually, so you have carbon pricing on, say, energy sectors, but you have offset possibilities, so more like a payments for environmental services model that looks at land use. I was wondering whether there's any way that you have thought about whether, moving towards more a kind of policy guidance relevant kind of results of what would be the implication of these type of ways where you have in a way pollution tax and incentive for improvements, and this is actually differentiated by different sectors. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Astrid. I see two colleagues here. Marco, please, go ahead.
Ralph, thank you very much for such an insightful presentation. I think it provokes a lot of thinking about being from the FAO and from the Agri-Food Economics Division. This can be taken up to the policymaker, right? So I'm going to ask a few questions that combine, that need of using this kind of resource to bring it down to countries, but also on technical aspects of how you get there. Here, for instance, in the Agri-Food Economics Division, we are innovating with some modeling work that tries to move away from the modeling where you exogenously choke a system, right, towards a framework where you actually optimize the policy instrument towards certain objectives. And that takes me to what we do here, because here, when we look at food security and nutrition, you need to look at sustainable development from the broader aspect, not only the environmental, but also the economic and the social. So there has got to be compromises between how you move around these objectives, right? So I really embrace the idea of environmental comparative advantage, and I see the gains that you can have from an efficient carbon tax. Have you thought about what would happen when you play around with these multiple objectives? Because what is efficient, and I understand why it is efficient, is very clear to me, may not be optimal, right? You mentioned at the beginning optimal carbon tax, but I think you were referring more to the efficient carbon tax. It's likely that carbon tax that is optimal is going to be maybe lower, maybe higher, but we don't know until you factor in the other development objectives like, food security, GDP growth, or agri-food GDP growth, whatever you call it, poverty reduction. So that's one thing that I like to hear from you, because I think there are entry points to expand that kind of work, from what is efficient to what is optimal in the framework of sustainable development, of course. You need to think about the Tinbergen rule here, right? You have more objectives and so on. So that would be, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that. The second one is, when you take this to the policymaker, I try to explain this in a static setting. The questions that start emerging is, okay, if there are environmental gains from moving from one environmental comparative advantage to the other, how long does it take over time, right? And this also implies how do you define the environmental comparative advantage here, because today, in order to accommodate these multiple objectives, you start thinking about mixed cropping systems, where you no longer have one single commodity, but you have a composite of commodities produced on the same land, which cannot even be captured properly by input-output relationships in the accounts, right? So you take the example of Nicaragua, for instance, they rely a lot on meat, involving cattle and meat. So they don't have environmental comparative advantage there. They do have a little bit of comparative advantage in forestry. But the livelihoods of so many, producers would depend on the meat. How do you move from one place to the other? And in the modeling perspective, what does it mean? Because over time, as you say, maybe emission intensities are changing, but also the substitution elasticities are changing a lot. How do we take this to the policymaker? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Very interesting question. Should we go for another question, or you would like to respond, Ralph, and we'll go for a second round?
Yeah, maybe exactly. Maybe let me start.
Okay, we'll come back.
And then we'll continue the discussion.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much for these really interesting questions and comments. And you can see in a way that I started this when I was still an academic, because there you can kind of think about kind of what would be optimal in like an economic model, without thinking so much about how to then implement this on the ground. But in a way, I think it's a useful starting point, I think, for this discussion. So it's certainly not the finish, is certainly not the last word that is spoken here, but I do think it's useful to start, because, you know, as the colleague from the EU Commission was saying, you know, I think, I mean, the simple kind of textbook economics, at least is clear, that like a carbon tax or like an equivalent carbon pricing scheme would be the first best, you know, economic policy to respond to this. Now, I completely understand that this has a lot of, you know, this, you know, has a lot of problems in the real world, and you know, we heard, you know, many of them here. You know, there are the development objectives, there are adjustment costs, you know, that might make this difficult in practice. But I do think it's useful to start with that, because it, I mean, I do think, you know, it does address a common misconception. I think if you ask people on the street, is trade good for the environment? People would say definitely not. Yeah, and here you can see that at least if you start with the most simple and most standard analysis, it's a huge part of the solution, and that's the main message really I want to get across at this point, and not so much that this is something that tomorrow we should implement exactly the way I'm proposing here. Let's see. So what about, there were some more kind of specific questions. So the intersectoral slide. So I showed you one graph, but not the other one. So maybe we can you maybe go there again? I'll show you the. So it's a graph with like colorful wheels. So if you go back. Just keep going and I say stop. Back. Back. Stop. Yeah, this one, exactly. So so here what you see on the left-hand side is basically what's happening, you know, how expenditure is reallocated across sectors. So this is about the cross-sectoral effect, not the environmental gains from trade. And on the right-hand side, you see the associated emissions reductions. So maybe let's look at the right-hand side. So from what is the way to read this is basically that, you know, the move of expenditure from browner sectors towards greener sectors overall reduces emissions by something like 15%. That's how to read this right-hand wheel. And then, you know, the largest gain you get from energy. Yeah, because obviously that's a relatively brown sector. Then you get a reduction in expenditure on agriculture. And here, you know, I didn't say this, but I also want to be frank that our agricultural sector here is very broad. So you should really think of this more realistically as substitution within agriculture, away from, you know, whatever beef towards, you know, some greener products and so on. So that's how you read the right-hand wheel and the left-hand wheel. It's basically, you know, it's the expenditure side. So the red ones is, you know, you reduce expenditure on some sectors, and the green is you increase expenditure on other sectors, because it just moves from one to the other, which is why the 2.44% is both in the red and in the green. And it just says, you know, what it basically moves to. So I'll let you look at that. In terms of land use, so we do take that into account, you know, but it's still work in progress. So for example, you know, one thing that we have here is, you know, Brazilian agriculture doesn't look so good in our analysis, but that's because we now, I think, falsely allocate all land use changes, all the emissions associated with land use changes in Brazil to agriculture, which is not, you know, it's not the right thing to do. So I think we just need to work a little bit more on that, but we try to take that into account. Also, you know, there were a lot of questions about, you know, real world carbon policies being incomplete and so on. So one thing that I should say that we also do, so we have this kind of benchmark of sustainable globalization. So basically what you would have if you had this worldwide carbon tax, but then we also compare it to just, you know, what does trade look like now, and are we moving in this direction, or are we moving away from it? And what you see said for a long time, trade as it is in the real world now actually moved away from that ideal, and I think it had to do something with countries sourcing more from relatively brown origins. But then in the last I think 10 years or so, it's been getting better again, which I think has something to do with these countries making progress in terms of decarbonization. Let's see. In terms of optimization, so from an economics perspective, obviously the optimal carbon tax would be equal to the social cost of carbon, but it's basically very difficult to estimate what these social costs of carbon are. So I don't want to take a stance on it. We just took $100 now. And this would be optimal in a narrow sense if the social cost of carbon was 100. But what's kind of nice in a way is that this result that the environmental gains, or that these environmental gains contribute more than 1/3 is pretty stable across whatever tax you impose. So you can kind of pick your favorite social cost of carbon and then look at it. But it is true, of course, that in the real world there are many other objectives to take into consideration, and the economist answer would always be let's pick the efficient instrument to deal with the climate, and then pick some other policies to achieve all the other objectives. But of course, in the real world, it's not so easy. So I think one would have to think hard about how to make this more concrete.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. We have two questions that I see, two hands here. We have Jorge and then Clarissa. So Jorge, and then at the same time I'm monitoring. So online, please virtually raise your virtual hand if you would like to make any comment or ask any question. Thank you. Jorge, please.
Thank you, Ralph, for your presentation. My name is Jorge Soguero from the Office of the Chief Economist here at FAO. And I have a couple of questions about the model, which are in line with Marco's question about the behavioral dynamics of the switching from to a greener trade environment. And I was wondering if in the demand side, the model is the utility function actually has a environmental sensitive switch to not be so depending on the economics, and how this will affect the model. And the second question is about
Can you say that again? I didn't quite understand that.
If the utility function has a component on environmental sensitiveness.
Yes.
And the second question, the results we saw are very aggregate, but it's also assumed that, for example, diets will be fixed. So the same as technology, you said the assumption is there is no change. If diets will be also fixed in the agricultural sector. And also, if the model is also assuming in the supply side that producers just accept that the switch from producing what they were actually producing to the greener products that they have to produce, and is accounting for the cost.
Thank you, Jorge. Clarissa, please.
Thank you. I'm Clarissa Walding, also from the Markets and Trade Division. Thanks for the presentation and the discussion. It's very nice to see that FAOs and WTO's work so aligned. Mm-hmm. We've done some work on precisely this area in the last SOCO report. Mine is more a comment rather than an actual question. I was very spooked to see fisheries increase, the growth in fisheries sector increase, while in agriculture it decreases. And my comment is the following: how complex, incredibly complex it is to address this in the real world. Because it's true that it's a less GHG intensive sector, but it has also other very significant environmental concerns surrounding the fisheries sector, with, over a third of fisheries overfished, of global fish stocks overfished, and also the very significant human rights issues that have been emerging in terms of the fishery industry. So it is indeed very complex to put this into practice, because then you need to deal with all of the other issues in across the sectors. And again, it's just a comment. I was very surprised to see that. Thank you.
you, Clarissa. George, I understand you would like to also take the floor. Please, George.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ralph. That was really, really good. You had two slides with the cross effects. One was the country cross effect. That was beautiful. And this is how trade can help mitigation measures to reach out globally. You could see clearly the shift to countries that produce with lower emissions. The problem for us, and this is a point for FAO, was the cross-sector effects, where I saw agriculture was down. And this is the trade-off Boubacar mentioned in just after your discussion, which is we have to increase food production, definitely. And by increasing food production, we have to increase emissions. So for us, it's a very strong message that we get the scale effect, this sectoral effect, that we will have to work on technologies that can produce with lower emissions per capita. Now, I do not know how the input-output tables work in the model, because it may be that for agriculture, as the IO table is set, there are no alternatives, although for other things like electricity there may be. So it may penalize the sector a bit more, but it's a clear message that we need to work on climate smart agricultural production. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I don't see any other hands, so
so maybe
back to you.
Thank you. Thanks again. Lots of really interesting additional questions. Let me maybe go in reverse order. So one thing I should have probably made clear is that we don't have technological change in the model. So the only way in the model to go to net zero is to basically die, so it's certainly not a you would need like complete degrowth, for this to go to net zero. So it's clearly not kind of giving you the whole picture of what we need to do, can do, and so on. So what you say in terms of technology improvements is of course first order. One thing I also want to say again is that, and it's a bit unfortunate for this audience, but our level of detail in the sectors is just not very high in agriculture. Which is why you just get, this shrinking in agricultural output, which is of course, doesn't seem like what you want if you care about food security. The way I think about it is that, really under the hood, you have, if you think about the individual kind of components of agriculture, there's also a huge variation in the emissions intensity of those. So presumably you can get a reduction in agricultural emissions just by changing the composition of agricultural products in a way that kind of keeps the calories produced constant or even increases them. So I think it's just a kind of an aggregation problem that we have in the model. So then, in terms of fisheries, I agree that this is that's a little bit of a problem, I think, with the economics approach more generally that I'm kind of, thinking about a lot lately is that, of course, if you focus on one externality and then tax that externality, you deal with this one, but then, there's many other issues, and I think fisheries is a fantastic example. It's also one that's, of course, important to the WTO, given the fisheries agreement that we just had. So I think I need to look into that and think how. Ideally, of course, you would want to kind of tax all externalities, but then, it's certainly not what we do here. So I'm very sympathetic to this comment. Then, regarding the model, so we don't have any preference for environmental protection in the utility function. People just, maximize their utility, and the only reason they become greener now is because brown goods have become more expensive. So we could also, so that would certainly change things. Diets are not fixed necessarily. It's just that we don't have a lot of granularity in terms of food products, but if prices change, people are also going to adjust. And on the supply side, it's perfectly neoclassical. There's no kind of adjustment frictions. So it's very much kind of a long run view. And I recognize, and I mean, we had this discussion before, that's kind of a first order thing, of course, in the real world, that if you're doing cattle farming today, but then that gets more expensive, you know, we need to think about how to help you with that adjustment. Great.
Thank you, Ralph. Just my very last question, if I may. Because I'm more thinking, you know, as Marco and colleagues, I think and this is, I think, the importance now of sorry, let me turn on my camera here, on using the model, no, this scenario, because basically the model, you want to see what would happen if, you know, you apply this, you do that. And then the more important part is the interface with the policy, right? With the policy makers, and what does it mean in terms of to avoid such, because now what you categorize them of them, some of these sectors of products, whatever what you call, you know, more brown or browner or whatever, right? I mean, and this will be, and I think when you look at the agriculture sectors, you know, I mean, many of them will be, I would say, located in, you know, the lower income countries, and so they could be shifting out, you know, migrating, you know, out of these countries, going to other countries who are cleaner in terms of less brown, right? What do we do to avoid, you know, this is, I mean, part of the trade-offs, no, the economic and social trade-offs that we see for reaching our environmental objective. What do we do, for example, because I'm only thinking, you know, okay, you tax, you know, this carbon tax, you raise revenues. Anything can be done, I mean, according to what you see that could be done, probably for transfer of technology, for investment, for training, and so on and so on, just to avoid, you know, this type of, you know, shifts, and you may not have also a flexible labor market in the sense in those countries. Usually the labor markets are a little bit rigid, so in order to move in terms of skills, and so it's a little bit of a situation if you look at it from the policy perspective and the implication. What can we, you know, what can we do in order, you know, to also not, or to minimize at least, let's say, those adverse impacts?
No, I mean, all I can say is that these are, of course, exactly the right questions. I mean, we have this simulation in the model where we, you know, just say, well, you know, what if you were to redistribute the revenues, for example, that you generate with this hypothetical carbon tax, and turns out that you can could get, according to the model, you know, quite a long way towards kind of, you know, making the economic implications, kind of equalizing the economic implications across countries. But again, you know, for me, I mean, I think this is also what comes out of this discussion, that this is really just kind of a first step, you know, in terms of kind of laying the issue on the table. And now I think the challenge is, you know, how to get this kind of on the ground. And I think, you know, would be premature now to, you know, just use this model and have some kind of concrete implications of what we should do in terms of redistribution and so on. I don't think it's a bit too early to get there. I mean, in reality, of course, technology transfer and technological change is always very important. And as I said, it's not something that we have. Let me also say maybe just something at the end. You know, I believe in the usefulness of economic models, but I also know that, you know, these are just economic models. So when I say that you know, emissions reduction is like 25%, I mean, you know, I'm not saying it really has to be exactly 25%, you know, it's not a precise estimate, but I think it gives you a sense of the orders of magnitude. And one thing that I can confidently say is that, you know, we've thrown a lot at the model, we played around with different specifications, and you're just not going to get, you're not going to kill the main message. And the main message is that, you know, there's huge potential in using trade for, you know, as part of the solution when it comes to addressing climate change. And this is really the, you know, that's the only thing you take away from this, just as a starting point of a more detailed discussion of how to implement this. And for me, this would be mission accomplished. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have one, let's put it this way, I promise this time it will be the last one. We have from the Indonesian representation, Purna, please, you asked for the floor, so over to you.
Thank you, Bubakar, and thank you all for interesting briefing and Q&A. I think following up to what Boubacar said on what we do, I think FAO has done in terms of food value chain, for instance. The FAO have been talking a lot on how to make a sustainable food value chain, for instance, a concept that is not only, considering the environmental aspect of it, but also economic of it and social sustainability of it. So it all covers all aspects, and I think the thing that we must do is how to implement this concept. What is the right model that could be tailor-made to the needs of the countries? This is one of the things. And I do believe that not only we should take into account the environmental sustainability itself, but of course the all related aspect to sustainability, which is social and also economic. And if in the future there will be more deepened analysis and more work and collaborations between FAO and WTO in this regard, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this intervention. I mean, I was telling my colleagues last time they were in Geneva that I really think the work that is being done at the FAO is fascinating and also very, very important. I mean, I can think of a few things that are more important than food security, for example, or nutrition. So I'm certainly, and I think we are certainly open to not just continuing but also intensifying the collaboration.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. I think we come to an end, even Mamoon. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Let's close and then we can continue the discussion with Ralph and the team in the Chief Economist Office. He has also a team there, so we can continue. Yes, we discussed last time when George and I were in Geneva. Also, given our next edition of the State of Agriculture Commodity Market, SOC will be on trade and nutrition. And of course, as you can imagine, as you said it, I mean, you started on the line that many people say trade is bad, and this and that, but could be part of the solution if you have the appropriate policy. And I think this is our line too. On the trade and nutrition too, so we hope we can collaborate also. It's a very important area, and the report is being prepared by George and his team here, and for publication in June, July 2024, so about 1 year from now. So that's also an important area there to collaborate and a lot of interest there. With that, Ralph, I think I wish just to thank you very much for the opportunity. I think, as you say, that's a lot of questions also that I hope we can work on together, and just on behalf of all the colleagues to extend our thanks to you, and we hope to continue on this collaboration. So with a small applause, and I thank you for Ralph, please.
Thank you.